Welcome back, everybody. This is Nightflight. I'm Judd, and today Dr. Judd Burton is back. And we are going to talk about the flood and the Nephilim and a lot of things that are connected to that entire subject. So, Dr. Burton, welcome back to Nightflight. It's year 3 of the madness.
Thanks to have me back, and I'm happy to be in sane company.
yeah, that's getting rare these days.
Indeed. Yeah.
So, interestingly enough, recently I had Troy McLaughlin as an interview guest, and we briefly touched on the flood as well. And he argued that he does not believe that what is mentioned in the Bible, the Son of God, the sons of God, my goodness, that these were the angels, because there is no other mentioning. Angels are always called angels, never sons of God. Angel is a messenger. It could be a device, he said. It could be a person that is a messenger. And so he said he's not convinced that these sons of God were the angels. What say you?
I have to sit on the opposite side of the table.
Okay.
Only insofar as that there are some other references to the sons of God. I think he may be talking about context, but the whether you call them angels or not, they're celestial beings. And we get in Western languages, we get hung up on, these broad brushstrokes for these categories of whatever it may be. That's just sort of the nature of the beast in Western languages. Whether it's Romance languages or Slavic languages or Germanic languages, they just sort of behave that way. But there are a whole host of what we might dub angelic beings, or melech in Hebrew, melechim, that constitute the divine council, as it were. Yahweh and his hierarchy of angelic and celestial counselors. And these aren't, they're not fat little cherubs, sitting around on clouds. There's some rather strangely described things. Now, they usually appear in the Old Testament as people. They're always described as men, but in their heavenly state, in their transdimensional state, if you will, these are pretty strange looking things. They're chimerical. They have multiple heads, and some of them have 6 sets of wings, and they're covered in eyes, and not what you would think of as angelic at all. But the point that I'm making is that there are hierarchies, and in Genesis, in the Old Testament, they're called the Benach Elohim, the sons of God, but they're sort of more specifically pinned down in the apocryphal literature, particularly Enoch, as the Egregorim, or the Watchers. So you've got a whole a class of that divine council. So whether we call them angels or members of the divine council or celestial beings or whatever, they're all part of the sort of the demography of heaven, if you will. They're part of that culture. And so I think there's a good case to be made there. Again, whether they're messenger angels, clearly they're not messenger angels only because the name connotes that they have a different or expanded role. You know, they're the watchers, they're guardians, you know, of a sort. And on one side of the heavenly coup, you've got people that were still Yahweh, or people that were still devoted to Yahweh, that were still loyal to him, like Uriel and Raphael. And then you had the notorious ones that rebelled, that were part of the satanic coup in heaven, if you will, who sided with the devil. These were notorious characters like Semyadza and Azazel and Kokabel and Barakiel. There's a whole laundry list of them.
Mm.
So I think you can get away with, that's probably not the right way to say it, because I mean, you're just dealing with a different kind of celestial being. So I think that there's some wiggle room there in terms of context.
A wiggle room in terms of identifying who is who, or a wiggle room?
Well, in terms of identifying what these members of the divine council were they
okay.
angels in the most generic sort of a sense? They could be, but more specifically, their role is it's ensconced in the name that the Hebrews gave them, specifically in this case the Essenes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. So now I forgot why he's where he said. I'm talking about Troy.
Troy.
The Nephilim came from. But he is also of the opinion that these so-called fallen angels did not produce the Nephilim.
So he doesn't believe that they're part of the pedigree of producing.
Yeah, because when it's always as long as you're not using CRISPR, blah 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 blah.
Right.
But it's, you know, interspecies. Yeah, it gets complicated. Even if you have a donkey and a horse that are pretty close to each other, yes, you can do that, but the progeny will be sterile.
Sterile.
And so he has doubts that even works, because
so is he sort of taking the Andrew Collins perspective that these weren't transdimensional beings, but they were some natural population, they were just more advanced? Okay. Well, yeah, I'm generally familiar with the more naturalistic interpretation of the sons of God and the Nephilim, but you know, if we're to take Genesis and the apocryphal literature as, you know, at least containing a nugget of historicity, you know, then we're dealing with not something that's just simply naturalistic from our perspective, but it has to be by its very nature supernatural, you know, where we begin to blur the lines between magic and technology. You know, what the humans at the time when they were on the earth would have undoubtedly dubbed magic may simply have been, you know, higher technology, more advanced knowledge. I think that's what's at play, but the agency doesn't seem to be terrestrial to me. The agency seems to be transdimensional, and the reason that I believe that are a number of reasons, and this will dovetail, I think, pretty nicely in our discussion of the flood too, is that the ethnologist and historian Jared Diamond wrote a book a number of years ago called Guns, Germs, and Steel. Excellent book, if nobody has read it. But
germs and what?
Guns, Germs, and Steel.
Okay.
Yeah, and he named it that because the apex of his argument dealt with the clash between the Spanish under Pizarro and the Inca under Atahualpa in the New World. And it's an interesting history of the world based on well, it's multidisciplinary. There's geography, there's epidemiology, there's anthropology. Basically, what he says is that the reason that the Spanish and the Europeans in general were able to overpower most of the New World was not because they weren't not because they were better or braver or even more capable on a general level than people in the New World. It's just that there were all of these distant causes that set up Europe to be in a more advantageous position in terms of biology, in terms of technology, and those sorts of things. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. He talks about the continents. The continent of Eurasia is long east to west, and the Americas are long north to south.
Mm.
And his rationale, one of them was that because of the latitude lines, in other words, you'd have similar, if you traveled east to west, you'd have very similar climates along similar latitude lines. And when plants become domesticated, you have agriculture and animal husbandry and metallurgy that begin to come out of the ancient Near East. Those things spread east and west along similar latitude lines, so that there aren't really landforms that are obstacles in their way. The climate is very similar, and so it makes for ease of transference. Now, conversely, in the New World, when agriculture and civilization emerge in Mesoamerica, the opposite is true. It takes much longer for those ideas and techniques to travel north and south, because you're dealing with longitude now. So you've got different geography, you've got different climates, you know, harsh deserts, tropics, snow-capped mountains, tundra. You got all that stuff to work through in the various latitudes, so it was harder for those things to travel. And of course, we're talking about thousands of years here of this building up in the New World, or in the Old World, so that people in the Old World were able to develop things like steel weapons and gunpowder and firearms. And then there's the epidemiological question. How was it that the diseases in the New World didn't impact didn't impact Old Worlders like they did when they got there? Well, herd animals is the answer. For millennia, people in the Old World had been keeping bovine animals and sheep and pigs, and along the way inoculating themselves against certain diseases like anthrax and smallpox to an extent. There were no herd animals in the New World, and so their immune systems were not equipped at all to combat things like a smallpox, which was extremely virulent in the New World after the clash between Europe and the New World. So you've got several things at play here. You've got this outside culture of the Spanish coming into South America, and because of things like geography and technology and epidemiology, things that happened thousands of years before any of these people were even born, they were in an advantageous position to not only overpower but forever change the cultural trajectory of people in the New World, not just the Inca. And so this got me thinking about the change that happens in human culture about 12,000 years ago, where you begin to see the rudiments of civilization emerging. You have agriculture and animal husbandry, new technologies, stratification of society, centralization of religion and politics, all the classic hallmarks of civilization. It's this abrupt 90-degree angle change from when humans have been hunter-gatherers for millions of years by this point. And culture is irrevocably and drastically changed in this window that I'm talking about in prehistory, late prehistory. And this kind of change in human history is typically only facilitated by the kinds of interactions that I just explained to you from Jared Diamond's study. And in 11,000, 10,000 BC, that, in my mind, that has to be some sort of outside, more highly advanced group of people that impose these changes on human society. And you aren't really left with a human agency to be able to do that in 11,000 or 10,000 BC. And so whatever appellation cultures and even we today put on these entities, I firmly believe that, by analogy, by looking at Jared Diamond's work here, I firmly believe, by applying that similar logic, that you got some sort of transdimensional supernatural influence here of these highly sophisticated beings who have their own agenda, and because of everything that's happened before that, if time even applies the same way that it does to them that it does to us, which there's some indication that it does not, at any rate, they are set up to be in a far more advantageous position to both make changes and also to conquer.
Okay, so now that we have cleared that, some people say that the Watchers is something totally different, that the Watchers are also not so maybe we can do a quick who and who here before we go into the flood story. So now we have the sons of God, and who are the Watchers then?
Well, the Watchers are another general, they're a hierarchy, part of that hierarchy of celestial beings, angels. There seems to be, again, implicit in their name, some sort of guardianship or their, there's vigilance of some kind is a part of their duty. And there are apparently good, just Watchers that remain loyal to Yahweh, and then there are the rebellious ones who sided with the coup. And I've mentioned a couple of names, Uriel and Raphael, probably amongst the more prominent of the good Watchers, the ones that stayed loyal. And then you've got Semyaza and his lieutenants, and Azazel, so on and so forth. And so we're talking about analogous appellations for the same entities, essentially. Just keeping in mind that with all celestial beings, with all angels, we're dealing with both loyal agents and renegade agents.
You know what I just had to think of? Have you ever seen this TV series Fringe?
Yes.
Yeah, and there we have these characters, the observers, these very pale and bold, and they're always in black suits.
Yeah, they're kind of the Men in Black kind of scenario.
Yeah. Yeah, and they called them observers, and somehow that reminded me of Watchers. Yeah.
Yeah, that was an excellent series.
Yeah, and then they said that it appears that they were always at certain important points in history. So But later on, these observers take over the entire planet.
Yeah, I remember.
And yeah, they even start changing the atmosphere and so on and so forth. So I'm not quite sure if that is a coincidence, observer, watcher, and then on top of it, okay, those that we introduced as observers are actually ruining everything.
Yeah, well, I mean, maybe not. That's an interesting. When you watch that show, for folks who have seen it, and are familiar with this, pre-flood Enochian sort of stuff we're talking about, it's hard not to draw those conclusions that, hey, the guys that wrote this stuff must have been, at least passingly familiar with this, because in a way, I mean, the Watchers were changing the environment that they came into rather drastically. And I'm not just talking about geography or climate, which would be epiphenomenal, but we're talking about genetic tampering on a vastly sophisticated scale.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's, if you want to call all that collectively a kind of terraforming, that was certainly I think it would fall under that definition.
Terraforming, yeah,
Mhm.
exactly. That was what the observers did in that TV
Yes.
series. They kind of erected a dictatorship, and it
Yes.
was really vile.
Yeah. Well, again, the same thing happens under the Watchers. That, I wrote a paper earlier this year called "The War of the Words" about the word Rephaim and its relation to royal titles in Eurasian languages. And
Okay. Oh, that's interesting. Please do tell a little bit.
yes, absolutely. There's been quite a bit of buzz about it amongst my fans lately. But because I sort of had that Indiana Jones moment, when he, in the first movie, when he finally gets the right height for that staff and gets the crystal. They figured out that the other guys were digging for the ark in the wrong location, and I sort of felt like that, when he gets into that room and the crystal shows him where the ark is. I really kind of felt like that when I looked at this, and I'll tell you why. Is because just for brevity's sake, there's a established relationship between the word Rephaim, which was one of the giant tribes, in my opinion, the earliest post-flood giant tribe. But there's a relationship between the Rephaim in Hebrew tradition and the Rabba Apsu in Mesopotamian tradition, the old ancestor god kings that occupied the abyss. And then it's really fleshed out in the Phoenician material, the Ugaritic material, where you actually have the funerary rites that the Phoenicians used to honor what they called the Rapha Umi. And so you've got this phonetic morphemic similarity between all these words. They're basically alluding to the same entities, these long dead god kings, ancestor kings. And I begin to wonder if there were remnants of this word in other languages in Europe and Asia, because so many of these words are coming from the Akkadian Sumerian base for later Mesopotamian languages. And the Sumerians weren't indigenous to southern Iraq. They were actually from the Trans-Caucasus region between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. Well, that's the Proto-Indo-European heartland. That's the land that the linguists say that Proto-Indo-European came from, the so-called mother tongue that all the languages of Europe and Asia sprang from, as peoples began to migrate out of that region. And I thought, I wonder if there's some overlap here, if that idea of these kind of despotic god kings a cognate in linguistics, if that was retained at all in these words. And so I began to look for, I isolated the initial morpheme of these words. And in Semitic languages, you know, you can play kind of fast and loose with the vowels because they aren't really there. Those come later with, you know, vowel markings and things like that, but it's all consonants. And so I isolated it to the initial morpheme, the R, and whatever vowel and consonant combination came later. And I wondered how many of those I could find if I did just a cursory summary of European and Asian languages. And I kept finding more and more. You know, 5 or 10 would be interesting, but I found close to 80 words, and this is just the initial study. I'm not done with it. But words like Rex in Latin, and Cray in French, and Roy in Spanish, and all the Celtic languages. Yeah, regal, royal, all the Celtic languages, Manx and Cornish and Gaelic, it's all Hree. The Slavic variants are very similar. In Sanskrit, the word for king is Rajan, and there are lots of languages in Southern and Southeast Asia that were impacted by Hindi and Sanskrit. And so you have lots of variations of Raja and Rajan.
Rajasthan.
Rajasthan. There is a Tagalog word in the Philippines, which means the chief or king. And I thought, okay, now this seems to track. You know, if people like J.P. Mallory and Gimbutas are right about Proto-Indo-European, this seems to be pretty compelling evidence that the idea that we have for king, in other words, the absolutist, despotic, you know, ruler, centralized ruler, really does seem to be retained in words that we've inherited for king or ruler or prince or what have you, going all the way back to this very old word, Rabbah or Rapa, Rephaim, if you will. And I think that's not accidental. I think that's by design. I think, you know, if you look at the classical early civilizations like Mesopotamia and Egypt and Harappa, these civilizations emerged as in terms of political entity, they were theocratic monarchies in which the rulers were either considered gods themselves or messengers of the gods,
or
progeny of the gods, or having some sort of divine pedigree. This is true not only in mythology but also in history. Lots of overlap there. So my thinking was that, okay, the politics of heaven, if you were, laid out in the Bible, is a kind of you know, it's set up where Yahweh is a just and benevolent ruler, and here come the Watchers and their progeny, and they turn that on its head, and they're selfish and ambitious and despotic and absolutist and tyrannical and every other thing, and that's the government that they set up on the planet. And so my paper was an exercise in sort of linguistic archaeology to see if there was any connection here. And I think that I've made, and my peers seem to think the same thing, that I've made a pretty compelling argument for that.
Have you also investigated if that also links back to Ra?
Yes, again, you know, just for brevity's sake, I didn't go into all of it, but there are more proximate ancient words, if you will. In fact, the Linear A Greek that the Minoans spoke, Ruja was the word for king. We get a bit of that from, I think it's on the Phaistos disc that relates the, it actually mentions King Minos. Ruja Mina is what it says. So there are certainly ancient words that are closer in terms of time, that speak to this connection to these older god kings, the Rephaim, if you will. And all they're doing is, you know, in the post-flood world, they're rebooting what the Watchers did in the pre-flood world. They're trying to set up that political structure again. You know, and again, the emergence, just the most cursory of studies on the emergence of civilizations and city-states will give you the non-supernatural, you know, facts that this was the political structure that developed in these places. This is how they viewed their deity, their rulers, and that lines up clearly with this culture, you know, that the Watchers and their first progeny, the Nephilim, engineered, and then you have the Rephaim rebooting it in the post-flood world.
Okay. No, I was so gone because I was listening. I forgot my thought. Can you believe that?
It happens to me too. Don't worry about it.
Having a senior moment. Okay, yeah, here it is. So now, what was the reason for? No, maybe we can start there. Do you think that the biblical flood was a worldwide event, or do you think it was localized? I mean, honestly, depending on what, you know, how much is flooded, if you do not possess communication means, and depending on your, you know, where you are, it can certainly look as if the entire earth is flooded. So do you think that was the case, or was it more locally?
Well, I think it's both, and and I'll explain what I mean by that. I firmly believe that the Noahic flood, the flood in the Bible, the flood that the Mesopotamian epics talk about, the flood that Hesiod talks about involving Deucalion. It's Deucalion in the Greek stuff. It's Noah in the Old Testament. It's Utnapishtim in the Mesopotamian stuff. You know, and these stories are global. I think at the end of the day, we have to admit that something happened that seared itself into our cultural memory as a species, or else we wouldn't tell these stories with such limited variation in them in terms of characters and themes. And I think that there's good evidence to line up the Noahic flood with a series of events that happened during the late Pleistocene, often called the Younger Dryas event, which you may have heard of before. But it's a series of climactic and geological changes that are taking place at the end of the Pleistocene as we're coming off of the last ice age. This series of events probably, well, not probably, I mean, we know that it happened because it's recorded in our geology. Happened between, you know, the 10th millennium BC and probably on into the 9th and maybe the 8th, but certainly the 10th and 9th millennia BC. You have this series of events that transpire And there are really strange things happening at this time in terms of our climate. It's a peak solar period, so you've got all kinds of mass coronal ejections that are being flung at the Earth. That stuff is breaking through the Van Allen belts in many places, hitting the surface. We know that it is because we can look in the archaeological record and find melted rock, vitrified rock, basically, that's been exposed to this radiation. We also know that the ionizing effect on the atmosphere was very clear at lower latitudes, because we have very similar rock art patterns in the rock art on these lower latitudes. The kind of patterns that you find in the aurora borealis and the aurora australis, you would have found at lower latitudes. And we also know that there were periods of flash flooding and flash freezing. That's why we find megafauna intact, with their last meal undigested in their stomachs, is because they were literally flash frozen. But there was, the flip side of that, when you throw in the solar stuff too, and people have to remember that our weather is controlled by the sun. Our movement around the sun, our facing of the sun, our slight tilting and variations against solar radiation, that's what controls our weather. And if you get these peak periods of very intense coronal mass ejections, that's going to have significant impact climatically. And so not only do you have these periods of flash freezing, but you have periods of flash flooding. And of course, this is playing all kinds of havoc, wreaking all kinds of havoc on our mantle and our core, especially. So you're going to have all kinds of seismic and volcanic activity as well. And we know that there's a huge reshaping of the topography, the geography of the surface of the Earth during this time, because again, you're coming off of the last ice age, and you've got sea levels that are rising. So you throw all of this together in the mixer, and what you have is a recipe for a climactic and geographical tumult over a period of time, so that you have lots of things that have been low-lying lakes, inland lakes, being broken through, because you've got all this extra water melting into it from the seas and the oceans, and you've got the flash flooding element at work too. So you've got lots of localized flooding, but it's happening all over the planet.
Okay.
And so it can be viewed as localized, but the event in its totality is literally a worldwide flood.
Okay. Have you ever heard the Zulu myth about the two brothers that brought the moon?
I don't think so.
Okay, because it's quite interesting. Okay, this story goes like this. There were two brothers. The name was Wovane and Mpanku. So, and they stole an egg from the fire dragon. Then they emptied it out, and they brought this fire dragon egg as a moon here to Earth. And in their story, before this moon came, we had a very stable climate, not these harsh differences that we know now. It was usually very nice, very warm. It was abundant. And the earth had a water canopy around it. And when the two brothers, and some acquaint them with Enki and Enlil. Yeah.
I can see that.
So, and so when they brought the moon here, then that was, how they say it, the end of the golden age. The earth tilted because of that event a little bit. The water canopy crashed down to the earth, and that was the beginning, the end of the golden age and the beginning of the flood.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
That is, yeah, that is interesting. It does make you think of Enki and Enlil.
Yeah. Yeah, it does.
I'll have to look more into that. That's a Zulu tale, you said.
Yeah, have you heard of Credo Mutwa? Many years ago, Credo Mutwa, many years ago, David Icke interviewed him, and he talked about a race that they call Chitauri. But yeah, Chitauri are reptilians. And they have very vivid stories about the Chitauri. And as he explained it, I guess he was, I think, I'm not quite sure, I shouldn't say it if he isn't dead, it's embarrassing. And so yeah, he's a Zulu shaman, and he has a very good knowledge about all these myths, and he explained that story.
Fascinating.
And that is not the only culture. There is one in South America with slight variations, but also there, two brothers brought the moon. And so many say, yeah, it makes sense because the moon is a later edition. It's somehow a little bit weird. It shouldn't be where it is, and it's too big for, you know, the Earth didn't capture it. It's too big for that. The distance from the Earth is a little bit fishy, and there are a lot of anomalies around this moon. Yeah. So who knows? Maybe it was really maybe that egg was not an egg, and maybe what they emptied out of that so-called egg, maybe that was technology that they didn't like and brought it, you know.
I would love to hear a compelling argument about it. I'm not discounting it.
Yeah, okay, that of course is speculation.
Sure.
Yeah? I was just because we have also these stories that the moon seems to ring, and yeah, somehow I don't have a problem thinking that this is an artificial satellite.
Yeah, I don't either.
Yeah,
I don't either.
Yeah.
It's hard to say definitively, but I mean, I'm not going to rule it out.
Yeah.
And, if that's the case, you could see how it would, because it continues to. I mean, the moon has a tremendous effect on everything that happens on the planet.
Yeah.
From tides to people's moods. All you got to do is read the newspaper when there's a full moon, and you'll see how many people are arrested and admitted to the hospitals, and there's a there is a definite statistically demonstrable influence that the moon has on the Earth.
Yeah, so that was the Zulu myth, and yeah, some cultures, they bring that together, end of the golden age and then flood.
That's right. That's also pretty much a perennial feature in most flood epics. Is that there was this period of high achievement and high advancement. I also think it's the same cataclysm that destroyed Atlantis. You know, I think Plato's reckoning, his numerical reckoning, is actually pretty close, because he said that it was 9,000 years before Solon, his ancestor, one of the Athenian aristocrats, and that puts you square at the end of the Pleistocene epoch. You know, 9,600, 9,500, when you know, arguably the Younger Dryas event had begun to commence.
So now, but if we follow the biblical report, then it sounds more as if it was pretty bad here. There's not a lot of talk, in fact, none, about huge advancements.
Well, and that's not to say that there weren't huge advancements.
Yeah, but it reads more like, yeah, okay, the Nephilim were the progenies, and everything from there went down in a handbasket.
Right.
And it was, do you hear that? My cat has her 5 crazy minutes. Okay, so, and yeah, whenever I read that, I have a very uncomfortable feeling. It does not read, in my mind, as if that was a pleasant time.
I think the closer that it got towards the flood event, certainly the less pleasant it was. And again, you know, looking at you know, the Watchers in the Mount Hermon event from Genesis 6 as the, you know, they're the same people as the Apkallu, same entities as the Apkallu in Mesopotamia, and the Titans in Greek mythology. You know, these rank and order of gods. You could sort of look at maybe the lower ranks of the Watchers and the Nephilim as the second tier gods. You know, the Olympians, if you will. And they did you know, Enoch is really clear about it. You know, that the Nephilim did sort of outgrow the leash that the Watchers had put on them, so much so that the Watchers were afraid of how violent and ruthless and just awful that the Nephilim were. And I remember the first time I read that, I said, that's amazing. What does it take to scare an angel? What does it take to frighten one of these celestial beings and think that they've lost control of something that they were supposed to have great power over? And so certainly that the Watchers, you know, the Apkallu, the Titans, whatever you want to call them, they had selfish ambitions, but that just sort of multiplied exponentially with their progeny, the Nephilim, and you know, the chimera that they created, and the successive generations of these things, because you know, it's very clear they consumed all the resources of humanity. This lines up very well with the extinction of megafauna. You know, if we're talking about gigantic hominids, they need more caloric intake. And so, you know, and there's a kind of unknown variable, and scientists admit to this. There's a third, I think it's called the third agent hypothesis, you know, in how the megafauna were, you know, how they became extinct. You know, the prevailing thing is that it's a combination of overhunting and climactic features, but the identity of all the hunters is not necessarily there, and so there's this I think it's called the third agency hypothesis. Well, it's pretty clear to me who the third agent is, and probably the most important were these Nephilim. If we're to believe these ancient accounts about them, that they consumed all of humanity's resources, and then when they did that, they turned on each other and fought these bloody wars and started eating one another, and then they turned to eating humans. All under this, this topsy-turvy social political structure that the Watchers and the Nephilim had set up in the pre-flood world. So that, yeah, some of this technology was probably great, or advanced knowledge was probably great on one level, but just like we're dealing with in the modern age, we've got lots of great technology, but it's clearly being weaponized for selfish and nefarious reasons. You could see how a microchip in the brain might help somebody to walk. That's fantastic. But it might also turn them into, an automaton or a computer of some kind to be used by an outside agency. And it's the same scenario in the pre-flood world. Everything gets twisted up and mangled up, so that really there's a moral breakdown because of and you have to take all of these things that I've been talking about in combination. The end result is this huge moral breakdown in human societies, to where they begin to emulate the wickedness and the ne'er-do-well nature of their rulers, and the world just turns into this, almost opposite of the golden age that's described in a lot of mythologies. And so there's a, I think that there's a case that can be made here, for not only that breakdown and other minute details that point to the flow of events in the pre-flood world, like the extinction of the megafauna and the ensuing of the Younger Dryas event. I think it lines up pretty nicely with the flow of events described in many of the world's flood epics.
Yeah, and also we have in Egypt, we have the water weathering of the Sphinx. So
yes,
this monument has to have been underwater at the
I asked Dr. Schock about that, Robert Schock, the fellow who did the redating on the Sphinx, which I think is a valid study. I agree with him. The only time that the Sphinx enclosure could have been exposed to, and I think we're talking about rainfall, probably not but it could have been, arguably would have been during one of these periods of intense rain, that was taking place in the pre-flood world. At one time he said, as much as 7,000 years ago, but he's since moved that back to 10,000 plus years in terms of the building of the Sphinx. And again, I just think he knocked it out of the park when he demonstrated the weathering on the Sphinx enclosure. You don't get that from desert wind and dry wind erosion. That's water erosion.
Yeah, exactly.
And water erosion that's indicative of a temperate climate, which North Africa had not been since the Neolithic period, essentially.
I think he also was in this documentary that Graham Hancock did, 10,500 BC, Quest for a Lost Civilization. And there they also used this computer program where you can dial back the sky, let's say to 10,500 BC.
Yes.
And then, the Sphinx is actually looking into her own image, the lion.
Right. Yeah, then that speaks to a very sophisticated knowledge of astronomy at the time, which, again, Enoch tells us that there are several of these watchers that teach humanity how to observe celestial movements.
Yeah.
And of course, if you can do that, you can extrapolate higher order mathematics, calculus, engineering, and then before you know it, you're constructing megaliths.
Yeah, and I think during that time they didn't even distinguish between astronomy and astrology.
No, there was, not until historically, not until fairly recently. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
right.
yeah. And and then astrology got a very bad name. Some of it self-inflicted, and but I don't see it as a foretelling instrument or something like that. What I like to use it for is to see what energies am I dealing with. Yeah.
Well, and I think that's kind of, at least to an extent, um, if we generally call both of those star watching, including planetary movements and other kinds of celestial bodies and things like that. It's really about clock reading. You think of from a biblical perspective, it is a kind of clock and a prophetic clock at that, but it's also a monument, an unfolding monument to to all of Yahweh's creation, all of the things in the universe, acting as they do, as a kind of universal clock. And so there's that aspect of it. I think what the Watchers did, and what their progeny especially did, is again weaponize star watching for their own ends. And it ended up playing a part in the demise of the pre-flood world.
Mhm.
And you see a legacy of that once that Watcher knowledge is sort of rebooted. I have my own ideas about how that happened. I think the Rephaim are the culprits here, but I also think that Canaan, Arphaxad's son, who's described as finding the writings of the Watchers inscribed on a rock that apparently survived the cataclysm. And you get I think that's really where you sort of get the reboot start in the post-flood world. But yeah, ancient peoples and prehistoric peoples especially didn't intellectually compartmentalize things the way that we do today. There's a really good book called Hamlet's Mill
Mhm.
that talks about this, that looks at the most antique civilizations, um, and how they viewed myth. That myth was not just this, wasn't just stories about the gods, but it was, the stories of those gods correlated to movements of the planets and the stars, and it got people looking up at the stars because that's where they thought their gods came from, and then they're able to extrapolate mathematics and engineering from that. And so myth was it's theology, it's history, it's philosophy, it's medicine, it's this net that catches all of the various, what we would call disciplines or fields of study today. But
Mhm.
ancient peoples and prehistoric people saw that as a unit, as a whole.
Yeah.
These bodies of knowledge, contributed and overlapped to one another. They would give and they would take, and they didn't really view, today I used to joke with my students, we view college majors in fields of study like a Chinese food menu. You know, we take one from column A and one from column B and one from column C, and we've got a combo meal, right? Well, you know, that's really epiphenomenal of like the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment period, you know, where we really start to compartmentalize our knowledge like that. But when you're looking at the ancient world, and I'll allude to the study again, the Hamlet's Mill, and not only that, but the myriad ethnographies that have been written by anthropologists on myths for decades, that people who are pre-industrial and pre-literate, you know, hunter-gatherers and nomads, they don't view mythology and religious lore the same way that the modern mind does. It's still very much like that ancient perspective on myth.
Yeah, and we are losing a lot of insight and knowledge and wisdom because we are separating everything.
Agreed. One of my best friends just wrote a book on that subject. Luke Lafitte, he wrote an excellent book. It's about to be out under Barron Company, and it examines that very issue.
Yeah, exactly. So that was a fantastic first hour. I can't wait until we make a short break. So now this is the public hour, and we will see you all next time, and we see the patrons on the other side.